All right, guys. So, hey, we're going to be doing a little bit more equation solving today, but I promise it won't be as involved as what we have done before. All right. So, but we're going to do some, it's going to look different though, but totally doable. All right. So the first thing I want to remind us of is when we are solving equations, that we need to remember to, whatever you do to one side of the equal sign, whatever operation you do on one side of the equal sign, you must do the same on the other side. Okay, so that's one thing to remember. And then the other thing that we always want to remember is so that was number one. And then the second thing we always want to remember is that we're always working to isolate the variable. Okay, that means what? Get it by itself. So variable by itself. By whatever means we can. Up until now, it's been either making 0 or making 1. But because we're going to be dealing with the thing we talked about earlier as square roots, this is going to look a little bit different this time. All right, so let's start with this example here. Let's just start with an example. So for example number 1, okay, I want to say, let's say that x squared, so we've never had an exponent on a variable before, but let's just say x squared equals 25. Okay, remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out what is x. What's the value of x? So we're trying to think of what number times itself equals 25. And to undo, this is what I would say, to undo x squared, which is what I'm really focused on is this squared, we have to square root both sides. Okay, so we still want to do this. Whatever we do to one side, we do to the other. But because they're opposites, remember square rooting is the backwards or the opposite of squaring. That's what we talked about earlier this week. So square rooting is the opposite of squaring. So that's how I can get x by itself. So this is what it looks like. I would square root this and square root this. And what happens is the squares and the square roots, they kind of cancel each other out, and that just leaves you with x. X equals, now you have the square root of 25, which is what we talked about on earlier this week. So we can say 5, but the thing I didn't really mention in class, it was in the video, but it wasn't during our class time, is that there can be one more answer. Because remember, what we're really looking at is, well, this is because, if we remember when we wrote our answer, it was because, right, 5 times 5 equals 5 squared, which is 25. But there's another number that also equals 25 when I multiply it by itself. And that's -5, because -5 times -5 also equals a positive 25, because that negative times a negative makes a positive. So when we're solving equations, when we're solving for x, we want to find all possibilities. We want to find all possibilities. So this +5 is one possibility, but there is one more possibility. We have one more answer that it could be. It could be -5. So we could say it's 5 or x equals -5. Now, we could write both of those out and say, oh, these are the answers. Or, math people, we probably came up with a symbol, and we did, to make it easier. So we could just say x equals, and we put positive and negative together in the same problem, and we would say positive negative 5. These two answers are the same. They mean the same thing. All right, so when we're solving equations, so whenever there's an x or a y or whatever variables involved, we have to keep in mind that there's two possible answers when I'm squaring something or square rooting something. All right, so let's look at another example. Oops, let's do this. Okay, so for example number 2. Okay, so for example number 2, let's say I want to do x squared equals, I don't know, 4. We'll start with something kind of not too hard to do. All right, so whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. We undo x squareds by square rooting both sides. So notice I did it to both sides. And the exponent and the square root symbol cancel each other out. And I get x equals, now we've got two possible answers. I could have 2, or I could have negative 2. Remember, because 2 times 2 equals 4, or negative 2 times negative 2 equals 4, right? So 2 squared or negative 2 squared. Both of those work. All right, so I could write this, or we could use that new symbol. We could say x equals, and this is how you would say it, plus minus 2. Okay? By the way, you need to show your work by actually literally writing the equation, showing me the square root on both sides, and then showing me both possible answers. Okay? Well, both possible answers meaning the positive and the negative. All right. Hey, what happens when it's not one of those numbers? It's not one of those numbers that is on my that number line that I gave you guys, right? It's not a perfect square, because we talked about perfect squares before. What happens when I get x squared equals, say, 7 or something like that? Is this a possible answer? Can we still do this? You can. You can do it with a calculator, okay? So we would say, I'm going to square root both sides. Right? I get x equals, the easiest way to do this is just put the plus minus sign. So what you can do is go to a calculator. So I'm going to go to my calculator, which is one that I can write with. Okay? So I'm going to write down, what's the square root of 7? And it's going to tell me, it's going, now, do you see these dots here? These dots. Oops, it just went away. Okay, these dots. Those dots mean this is one of those numbers like pi that goes on forever, and it doesn't stop and it doesn't repeat. So what we're going to do is round to the nearest 10th. So the 10th place is the very first decimal spot. So I'm going to go, and we're going to have to put here, it's not exactly equal to, it's about equal to. So we do squiggly equal signs. And I think it was 2.64, what was it? 5. 2.645 ... Okay, now if I want to round to the nearest 10th, okay, we got to go back to what we learned about rounding. Down to the nearest 10th. That means I need to find the 10th place. What's the 10th place? Well, the 10th place is one after the decimal point. So I'm going to look at the 6, and you look at the number next to it, and that tells you whether or not the 6 stays the same or does it go up 1. So this is going to be this will either be 2.6 or it's 2.7. And the 4, so if the number next to it is 5 or higher, 5 or higher, the number goes up 1. The digit goes up 1. Now, this is not 5, that's 4. So this is going to stay 6. So we would say that x is approximately equal to positive negative 2.6. So we use the squiggle lines because squiggle equal lines, because we had to round. All right, so if you have one of those numbers that are not a perfect square, that you cannot fit into your into that number line that we did earlier this week, then you're going to use a calculator and round to the nearest tenth. Yes, you still have to show your work. You still have to show your work. Okay, let's try another one. Let's do example 4. I want to know, we can use any variable we want. W squared is equal to 10, right? Okay, so I'm going to square root both sides because that's what I know will get rid of the x squared. And I get W. Now, 10 is not one of those numbers, that fit nicely. It's not a perfect square. It does not make a square. So I'm going to go to my calculator, and I'm going to do the square root of 10, and it's going to tell me that it's 3.162. So plus minus 3.162. But we want to round to the nearest tenth. By the way, it will always tell you which place value in the directions. So my directions are we're going to round to the nearest tenth. So that means I'm going to look in the tenths place. That's here at the 1. We're going to look at the number next to it. Ooh, 6 is bigger than 5, right? So that 1 becomes a 2. So the final answer is W is about equal to plus or minus 3.2. Okay, because the 6 makes it closer to 3.2 than it is to 3.1. Okay, so that's how we would do these problems. You can use a calculator. You still have to show your work. Showing your work means show me the square roots on both sides. If you get a non-perfect square number, use a calculator, but round to the nearest tenth. All right, guys? All right, we'll talk to you later. Bye.